Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
But I've always liked this. I've got like 6 of these, I always mark them up and I lose it. I got to do it again.
I have like some ACLU ones and a Girl Scout one.
Right.
But this is my favorite one because it has the other ones, and also it has a little bookmark.
Oh yeah, right. I could use that. Now, here's a fun one. You're talking about Biden and all the rest of that, and the 25th Amendment, and you realize that it's going to be hard for a vice president and cabinet to work. Yeah. But then there's this line, Section 4, where the vice president or of such other body as Congress.
Is this your first year here?
It is.
That's super cool.
No, what that could be a special commission.
Isn't it stunning? It's absurd.
Right.
It could be.
But there's that language there that's
not used.
no one ever even talks about.
No.
I don't think everybody hearings done.
No, nothing. No.
It's very different.
Anyway.
No, that is a.
Because this whole thing is a. Because it came up, Trump won, and all the rest, and then it came up here, but it's just weird. No, I'm fine. Yeah. And then they go, well, no, now we have 2 weeks, and you're not fine. And it's just
It contemplates what a medical emergency in a way, right? It's contemplating some sort of like the vote.
Right. Or yes, that's right.
Good afternoon. Test. Let's see, are you on?
So I have not yet been. I hear it's.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I've been to the Rocket Stadium. I've not been to the
Test.
No.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel today. And this is session 1817. My name is Alphonse Keesley. I'm retired from the university, but I still teach around here and have something connected to the title of our particular panel today. This is the Applied History and Contemporary Policymaking, how we can learn from our past to improve our future. And this is 12 o'clock on April 10th, 2025. Before we get started, let me read this particular announcement that's important to the university, which is, before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on the indigenous people, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and the issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work. We will also educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, and consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Now, probably many of you have already attended many sessions here at CWA. I'm going to tell you one more time, though, One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we're going to handle the Q&A. We will reserve the end of the discussion for the Q&A. We're using a note card system so that you can write down your questions, and I have to ask, can you do it as legibly as possible? I struggle sometimes when I'm doing this role in understanding what was that word. Anyway, if you could do that, I would greatly appreciate it so I can get your question answered by our panelists, if you will. We will also acknowledge the students so that they are going to be given first chance to actually get their questions responded to. And then we'll get to all of the other questions. If there's an sample of the same kinds of questions, I will just bundle those together. And so now, we're going to get started. Many of the panelists you may have already heard or seen before, but instead of doing their bios in the way it's typically been done for the past 3 days, I decided that I was going to ask interesting things about the panelists. Starting off with, if you know who Stephen F. Hayward is, he wanted us to let you know that he has seen the Grateful Dead approximately 65 times or more. Lisa Graves, who is sitting next to him, thought it would be interesting to share, and students, raise your hand if you're a student in the room, because I may have to do a little interpreting. Okay. Lisa would like you to know that she was an art and pre-law major, but the more interesting thing about her is that her CB radio handle was Roller Skate Kid. CB. And then we have Kate Schatz, who's next, should be right next, and she would like to share with you that she and her son went to one of our Rockies games last night with the Brewers, and she is a Little League coach in Alameda, California. No, I'm not going to do this to Devin Gray, who's sitting at the end there, but he shared with us that as a young child, or as younger than his parents, of course, he was able to do a party trick where he could name all of the presidents from George Washington all the way up to second Bush, the second Bush.
It's very little.
And Stephen asked him, could you do it backwards? And he said, yes. So now we're going to get started where we always do with these particular panels, is ask the folk to actually give us an opening statement about this particular topic of applied history and contemporary policymaking, how we can learn from our past to improve our future. So we'll start with Stephen.
All right, so do I need to turn this on? No, you can hear it all right? Okay, good. My voice is pretty loud too. I can actually make it worse than that. So in the sort of pregame show, Lisa and I were getting along too well and realizing that we're probably not going to get the elbows out on this panel until we get to the second order questions, which we will. But what Alphonse left off, as I said, I usually pair these things. I usually remind, especially an audience here at Boulder, that I'm a certified card-carrying member of the vast right-wing conspiracy who saw the Grateful Dead 65 times. And so a quick story here. See, I do this because I know it will appall Lisa. Make sure she doesn't like me as much as maybe she thinks she does. I got a call from an LA Times reporter some months ago who wanted to ask me some background questions about my graduate school classmate, a guy you all have heard of named John Eastman. And so I said, I know, okay. So the reporter was asking me, normally I don't talk to reporters about this stuff because it's just, I don't like to, but in this case I did. And so, her question was, how did you guys come by these very peculiar views about things we talked about yesterday? And I go through all this, and she says, God, you guys sound like a bunch of nerds. What did you do for fun? I said, we went to a lot of Grateful Dead concerts. Long silence on the line, because this clearly didn't fit what the expectations, right? I said, yeah, I once had to loan Eastman a tie-dye T-shirt because he didn't bring one, and just like, you can't get into one without one, right? So that made the story, actually, which, okay. So I have a, it's not really an ideological provocation on this panel, though maybe we'll come to that, I'll see. It's that we have a problem. The problem is we can't teach wisdom or good practical judgment. It's an art at best, but maybe we can arm it. And by arm it, I don't mean that literally like weapons and guns or things, but tools. And my witness for the problem is actually Robert F. Kennedy, the dad, not the one around today. He was at some meeting when he was Attorney General about education, and he said the following, I'll quote him here. I majored in government at Harvard and never learned anything which helped me in practical political situations or in overseas travel thereafter. How can universities answer this problem? And what he's after, I think, to sort of bring it up to date is, if you look around, you see appalling failures in expert judgment. Really, you can go back, well, as long as you want, but in recent decades, think of one that Phil Tetlock wrote about in his terrific book, Expert Political Judgment. Nobody, including our CIA, had any idea that the Soviet Union was in any difficulties in the 1980s or that the Cold War might end. When the historian at Yale, whose name is now blanking on me on the Cold War, he went to a meeting in 1986 of foreign policy experts and saying, shouldn't we have like a little contingent working group on what a post-war world might look like? And they all said, oh, what a ridiculous idea. Why would we do that? This thing isn't going away. And I can tell you, having read a lot of the declassified CIA assessments of the Soviet Union from the 70s through the 80s, they're embarrassingly bad and wrong. Not just a little bit. I mean, why do we even pay these people for such crap analysis? The more contemporary example that I think is probably more on the minds of people here, perhaps, was the rock-solid slam-dunk assessment of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I don't know why we don't just abolish the CIA and start over. Okay, I'm already going on too long. There is one parallel. I can go on a lot. I've written a long article about this. Another good example is back in the 80s. I remember this vividly. The expert view was Japan is clobbering us. They're way ahead of us, and the predictions were by very smart people like Clyde Prestowitz and Chalmers Johnson and James Fallows, who's a journalist, but a very high-end journalist, I think you'd say. Smart guy, always worth reading. By the year 2010, Japan is going to pass the United States in total size of its economy, and if we don't get on the ball, well, what happened? That didn't happen. They hit the wall around 1990 and have never quite recovered. They've never gotten that mojo back. So one question you might ask is, we might want to delve into why that happened to Japan. There are good theories, and then the obvious question is, are some of the same things going to happen to China? Aren't there some similarities between the dirigiste economic management of Japan that you also see at work in China? And therefore, but of course China, building a lot of military could be a dangerous thing, right? Sometimes tariff wars coincide with the outbreak of real hostilities. All right, I could go on a long time about that. I think we neglect historical case studies. And instead, we tend to default, especially universities, but also think tanks and all the rest. We like models and theories, especially in international relations, lots of theories. And they have some uses, but I think we neglect or have contempt for the careful consideration, not of historical analogy, but of historical case studies that could be illuminating. I'll give you just 2 points to get out and 2 examples, or maybe I'll just go to the examples right away. Actually, I'll give you just one rule, which is the most successful presidencies, I think, are the ones that have substantial disagreement at their highest levels. Starts with George Washington, with Hamilton and Jefferson fighting each other, and Hamilton usually winning and getting Washington to change his mind. The worst outcomes are usually in presidencies where there's uniformity of opinion. That happens to Johnson with his Vietnam War decisions, right? And misreading some lessons of history, I think, which we can come back to perhaps if you like. I think that afflicted the George W. Bush administration. On the other hand, one of my favorite moments from the Reagan years is when I think it was Helen Thomas gets up in high dudgeon and says, Mr. President, your Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, we're told they argue openly in front of you like this is a horrible thing. They don't have their act together. Reagan says, of course they do. That's what I want, right? And I think Roosevelt's administration, I describe that as productive chaos in a lot of ways. And you can do a lot more examples that you can go on. And so uniformity of opinion, and we'll decide as more details come out about whether that's a factor in Biden's presidency and so forth. I think that, sorry, I have too much in my notes. So last thing I'll say. sometimes it can come down to something very particular. So I think that a book that would be required reading for anybody who's in a decision-making role is the Graham Allison, Philip Zelikow book on the Cuban Missile Crisis called Essence of Decision.
All right.
There's one particular detail there, and I promise I'll end. So, day one, they say, well, we got to blockade Cuba. Okay, we're going to blockade Cuba, send the Navy out. But President Kennedy says, I don't think we want to call it a blockade. Why? A blockade is an act of war. Let us borrow the phrase that Roosevelt used, when, by the way, he was violating the Neutrality Act. Thank God he did, is my view on that. He said, let's use that phrase that Roosevelt used. We'll call it, we're going to quarantine the aggressor. So quarantine rather than blockade. May not seem like much, but in fact, I thought that showed some shrewdness of judgment on his part, and those things matter. I'll stop there. I went on too long. Sorry.
Thank you.
I'm going to start out, I think, uncontroversially, but we'll get there, I'm sure. When I was thinking about this topic, in some ways this is a bit of a potpourri because it's such an open-ended topic. What does this mean? What are the lessons of history that we need to know, that we can build on? And for me, I guess I would tell you that one of the real turning points in my life was when I was in college and I read A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And I had never heard this history. I had great teachers in many ways in the public schools here in Colorado. They were devoted teachers. One of the social studies teachers was one of my favorites. He helped sponsor a club, but I wasn't learning history in the most meaningful sense. I was learning the years of war, of battles of war. I was learning about a lot about the battles of the American Revolution, a little bit about the Civil War, race through the First World War and the Second World War, and then probably a week on Korea and Vietnam. And most of that was focused on, dates and deaths. So when I read The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn and read that first chapter where he talks about Columbus, setting off to find what they called the New World, misapprehending the size of the globe, his crew, dying from scurvy, malnourished, coming into the Caribbean and being saved by the Arawak people on that island who came out to the ship and rescued the men and fed them and nursed them back to health. And that night in his diary, he wrote, "The people are so docile that with a dozen men I could enslave them all." And I was shocked by that. I was so shocked that I actually went to read the footnotes. I was like, well, is this true? Where did he get this? How do I know this is true? And it was a moment, I'm sure it's because it was a moment of a turning point for me for understanding how much I didn't know about our history, about the history of my country, and also that I didn't know the history of this man, this person who was lauded as a hero, who was celebrated with Columbus Day, and had not realized that he was an enslaver. And in fact, subsequent diaries of his reveal how he went back to Spain and came back with more men to enslave people and bring them back to Europe. There's more in that book. The book, actually, that opening is like quite the opening. But the book itself is such an important book, I think, because it tells a part of American history that most history books don't tell, which is the history of social movements and the power of ordinary people to make change, which is why it's called A People's History of the United States. I would commend it to you all. If you've read it, read it again, because it provides, I think, enormous, really powerful lessons about the power of ordinary people to see a problem in their society, in a business, in a company they work for, in their state, and to take responsibility, like a moral responsibility, to change it, to make it better for everyone, to address the crises that were happening in labor in terms of the way workers were treated, or the mine workers, or factory workers, or the Triangle Shirt Waste Factory fire. To really take a look at these incidents where our country is growing, the industrialization is happening. People are experiencing this industrialization in a variety of ways. Some people are getting very wealthy from the power of capital to invest and make more and help those economies grow. And then some people are basically barely surviving in that structure, or being maimed or wounded, or their kids are in factories where their teeny tiny hands are really handy to help make armaments, but it's extremely dangerous. And so There's more, obviously, to that book than just some of those examples, but to me, it's an important part of our history that we forget. I think especially now, especially in the 21st century, where we have this culture of celebrity and this notion, in some ways, of the power of wealth from a consumer standpoint, the power of celebrity in influencing, and that certainly is real in our society, that some influencers have tremendous power, but they're not the only ones who have power. We forget our own power, our own agency. And if we can learn from these movements, from the women's movement that took more than 100 years to get women the right to vote, from the civil rights movement that fought for nearly 100 years to go from the promise of the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment to guarantee the right to vote to actually win the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Nearly 100 years of struggle. And they did not give up because they failed. They did not give up because there was repression. They understood this was a moral battle for themselves and for their future to help make the promises of our Constitution real. And so I guess that's what I would contribute as an opening statement.
Thank you. Kate?
Speaking of the Constitution, I didn't get the memo that we were supposed to bring our tiny copies. So I'm glad to know that if I need to reference it, that I have, I might need to borrow yours. I love the connections on this panel already, because I think that when I think of two of the things that were very influential for me as a young person, particularly as a high school student, one was the Grateful Dead. And I probably would have seen them 65 times, but my parents insisted that I stay in school and not travel the country going to concerts, but also reading people's history. And I remember vividly being in my AP history class and feeling very aware and very, very conscious that what we were learning in that class was nowhere near the full story. And feeling very, very aware that, yes, I wanted to get a 5 on the AP test, but also like, come on, this is not the story. And I would bring my copy of People's History to class with me and read it in the back of the room and always scowl at my teacher with a terrible attitude. So I think I don't like to define myself by what I am not, but I will say for the sake of this panel that I am not a policymaker. I am not a super wonk. I guess I can get a little wonky. And I'm not an historian by trade. I'm an author, and I'm a history lover, and I'm a curious person. And I think maybe what I can bring and the perspective I have is that ever since reading Zen years ago, I've had a real fascination with people's histories, with the untold stories. So the books that I've written mostly are for young people. They're nonfiction books about radical women from history, from the United States and from around the world. And then also I wrote one about movements in American history that we don't learn about that often, including the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and what that did for the labor movement. And I write these books, again, for young readers. They're really for people of all ages, but I'm very committed to the storytelling of history and how we make it interesting and fun. I have illustrations. I use bright colors. I really try to engage readers. And these are all of our stories, and they're fascinating. And women's histories are not just for women and girls to read; they're for everybody. And I've just always been fascinated in the stories and the histories of the people that were there. So for all of these moments of history that we've already touched on, as we've covered just in these few minutes, several centuries of American history, I'm always fascinated by the people who were also there, right? But whose names are not in the narratives. The women who were making policy, the women who were working, the people of color, the immigrants who were always existed. We're always making change. We're always working in communities, and we're always working to lead, right? Even when they didn't have access to power and capital, and to storytelling. I was on a panel yesterday. This week is really, I think it was yesterday, with Lewis Reed, who maybe some of you saw speak, and I probably wrote down half of what he said. He was so quotable, but he said, the people who are closest to the problem are usually closest to the solution, but they're the farthest from the power and the money. And that's a variation on a sentiment that I've heard and really agree with. And I really appreciated that, and I think when I think about what it means for me to be someone who writes about history, I think about part of getting those folks, those people who are closest to the problem and most impacted, and who have solutions and can help us shape our future. In addition to lacking money and power, they lack representation. And so that is something that I really try to do in my books and in storytelling and in the work I do with young people when I go to schools and I share my books, again, and talk about these stories and get these names known and out there. And yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Devin. In addition to being a history lover like many folks on the panel, I'm a lawyer by training. I lead an anti-poverty organization in California. I've worked in state government, national campaigns, and the like. I think we can all recognize that we're in like pretty perilous times at the moment, right? I personally find comfort in being able to draw upon, like folks have mentioned, the rich historical tradition of this country of being able to emerge through challenging moments to make our union better for more people on the back end, right? Like, while history may not repeat, it certainly does rhyme. And there are certainly moments throughout the nearly 250 years of the Republic that we have had tremendous social and political divisions, right? Whether it be the Civil War, whether it be Reconstruction and Jim Crow, whether it be emerging through 2 world wars, the Civil Rights Act, political scandals, whatever it might be. By and large, we have found a way to emerge, not even sometimes as a better country, but sometimes in the case of the Civil War and Reconstruction, a new country, right? Like through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we became fundamentally a different nation. And it's not to say that we are at a level of crisis that is at the level of literal civil war, but I do think there is something to be said about moments of crisis and political and social and spiritual urgency providing an opportunity for us to be able to redefine how we conceive of ourselves, right? And so I think by being able to tap into that tradition of self-transformation as a nation, we can try to find some modicum of optimism in a moment where I think there's oftentimes very little optimism. Like, I think we have an opportunity and we have agency to be able to try to shape a better future collectively. Obviously, in all of these moments of national question, the core of it has always been, who does this country work for? Like, who does democracy benefit? Who does it not benefit? Are we able to successfully build walls around our prosperity and access and power? Or are we able to extend that to more and more people? And again, we're a young country. We've had several instances of this. And it's not to say that we are certainly going to make it out the other side better off for it. But again, I do find some sense of comfort and agency knowing that folks have come before us, and again, our very short history as a nation, have been able to emerge the other side better off for it. There are obviously unique aspects to the moment that we're in, right? I think, again, we've not been short of political scandal and corruption in this country. We've not been short of deep social division. We've not been short of instances where our worst impulses sort of tell us to retreat inward and be isolationist and sort of shut ourselves off from global responsibility. I think what might be unique in this moment is that we have all of those things happening at once, right? And yet, I still think we do have agency to be able to shape a better future for ourselves. And again, I think in this conversation, we'll probably go in a million different directions because we have a really broad range of perspectives, and I'm really excited to dive into it. But what I'm trying to bring and sort of how I'm situating myself in this conversation is that I am trying to lean on history and those who came before us to be able to try to chart a better path forward. So again, it's very tempting to be pessimistic. I find myself pessimistic more often than not these days, but I think that by looking to the past, we can maybe find some answers for the future as well. So, thanks.
Thank you, panelists. This is a great start. I mean, lots of good information to work from here. I'm going to sort of go off the situation for a second and just mention something to those of you who are local, that there is a situation that's going on with Professor Patricia Limerick, who has a grant that talks about applied history. This is something that she's very much interested in, and when she was director of the Center of the American West, she had this particular quotation: turning hindsight into foresight. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept of applied history, everything that has just been said up here really are great examples of this idea of turning hindsight into foresight, which is going to be useful for us going forward. and so forth. And I just want to thank the people who have already submitted cards. I can read every word. But right now, it's time for the panelists to mix it up with each other based on some of the things that they've been saying to each other and going from there. And then I'll get to these questions. Who would like to challenge whom?
All right, Lisa. I think you. Okay. So my standard line is I prefer Zinfandel to Zin. But since you brought it up, no. Look, actually, I think I'm sort of a weird outlier here. I actually think the Zin book is pretty good. I have a lot of criticisms. Here's good at this reason. I mean, the idea that official history, or whatever you want to call it, is incomplete, or winner's history, that's not a brand new idea with Zinn. I mean, that was the famous Herbert Butterfield book, the Whig interpretation of history. I like to point out to people that, a lot of my conservative friends, that, if George Washington had been captured and hung, and the Patriot Army is defeated, today the Declaration of Independence might be an obscure footnote that only 20 people would know about and talk about. Okay, so the thing about Zinn is, it's very well written history. That's very important, that you tell history as a story and as a narrative. And you can do an analytical narrative, but the worst histories, just a brief editorial sidelight, is, I think the very worst were the cliometric histories of the 70s, and that very name should give you a clue. It was, when historians thought we need to be more quantitative, so therefore let's write histories that are so mind-numbingly boring that no one will get anything from them. By the way, it's a weird thing that the Harvard History Department, I believe, is still classified in the Social Sciences Division, and the History Department at Yale is in Humanities. Therein lies a big story. Okay, back to Zinn. So never mind any sort of factual quarrels or interpretive or contestable interpretive parts. I think the thing that ought to be raised about Zinn is, I think there's this tendency for his account to curdle to the point where we take the sins of America to be the whole of America. I think that's a great mistake that people make. Now, the part about that I agree with Lisa's presentation, or I actually may extend it. It's so social movements. So one of my, you might say, historical rules is that social movements both create and then the politicians follow. Sorry, they create and change public opinion, and then the politicians follow. I could go through it, but one of my favorites. People know the civil rights story is very well known, I think. We tend to overlook the temperance movement, which went on for a century before we got the 18th Amendment, which gave us prohibition, which gave us Will Rogers' observation that at least prohibition is better than no liquor at all. But nonetheless, that was a social movement, right? And you had and a real problem. I'll skip all the statistics about it. It's really, we forget this now because of what a misadventure that was. But the point is that I think I'll do this proposition. I don't think you'll disagree wholly, but the civil rights movement finally reaches its most important legislative breakthroughs with the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Housing Act, so forth. After public opinion shifts radically, it's, Gallup first started asking about racial attitudes in the late 40s, and they were really ugly. By the early 60s, that had changed, including it was starting to change in the South. The South lagged, but it was changing there too. And that's when politicians feel safer to take action that otherwise there's too much difficulty and resistance to. So. Yeah.
I'm not sure I disagree with any of that, except that, well, two things I would say. One is I am not a fan of Zinfandel, but I am a fan of Howard Zinn, for sure, without a doubt. Without a doubt. And there's definitely
Can we compromise on Merlot, like the movie says?
Sure, Merlot. But, when I read, I've got a copy of that, the original copy I have that's, bound together by a ribbon, because the pages have been, so taken apart. I really, I'm a skeptic by nature. It may not seem that way since I have a sunny, optimistic attitude, but or at least I try to have a sunny, but I wonder, is this true? How do I know this is true? What is the source of this? I am constantly asking that question about almost anything, and I don't think that book is written in a way that's that condemns America in the sense of that the sins are fatal. But I think it does describe the failings in ways that are actually really empowering, because it shows how people confronted, some of these challenges. And so, but I take your point on, if it's just a pox on everyone's house and it's America's evil and there's no hope and this is just, we've had this terrible history and there's no, I hear that sometimes in social media where people are basically saying both parties are terrible, there's no hope, it's all awful, I'm just going to, drop out. I don't think that dropping out actually solves problems. It doesn't solve problems. I think going to Grateful Dead is not dropping out. It's actually like a way of embracing life and enjoying life. And I think we need a healthy dose of both. Like, we need to really be savoring our life and creating joy and having fun. And also, I think, in society we have obligations to really try to help make the world better for ourselves, our family, our friends, our neighbors, and our country and the world. I was going to say, and this wasn't a point of dispute, but I appreciated that you started with wisdom. That is an area where I think we need greater teaching, more teaching for students at every level about critical thinking, about why you trust something or why you don't, and I think we've had a tremendous sort of degradation in the trust in science that's very anti-Enlightenment. There's this sort of anti-Enlightenment movement. There's actually a guy named Curtis Yarvin who's this radical right-wing neo-reactionary who has this sort of dark age view of things that I completely dispute. But he's been influential on people like Peter Thiel, the billionaire from Palantir, and J.D. Vance and others in his notion that we need a monarchy and we can't have a democracy. Democracy's failed. And this, I just don't agree with it. So I'm going to just toss that out there in case you have any sympathy for the fellow. But
Well, I know him, so of course.
But I do think I appreciated what you said, Stephen, about different, like having a cabinet where people are making robust arguments and sharing information to try to find the right answers in public policy. I think that's really valuable. I've got, I guess, 2 points on that I want to flag. One is when Bob Woodward wrote his book about the George W. Bush administration, the first administration, there were 2 points in that book that startled me. One was when he asked him about sending people into war, how did he sleep? And he said, I slept fine. And I thought, wow, like I think that is a point of view that it's hard for me to appreciate. I think even if I knew that I was doing the right thing, I would still not sleep fine knowing that people were going to lose their lives and sacrifice for our country, for the mission. The second part of that book that was interesting to me was he asked Bush, George W. Bush, how he made decisions because he had people who had disagreements, and he said something like, I'm going to paraphrase, they would argue, and whoever argued the strongest, that's who I went with. And I thought, that's a problem because if you have a scientist presenting something, the scientist is going to say, well, the studies show that predominantly X is true. It's not conclusive. We're still studying this, but here's what we predict based on the findings. Or you have someone who's looking at policy and they'll say, well, on the one hand, we could do X and Y, and this would have these positive benefits, but it could have some negative benefits. And that person would be perceived as weak by Trump, by Bush. Oh my goodness. Probably by Trump too. Sorry, that was not a Freudian slip, but this question of groupthink, which is part of that book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you have a person in a position of power who's surrounded by people who either are desiring to gain favor, to curry favor, they're fawning, or they just are sort of infused with this sort of small group zeitgeist of people all thinking the same way and praising each other and patting each other on the back, that can result in very bad decision making. And I think, and I'll just extend this a little bit further just briefly, which is I think that's partly why we can't have billionaires in charge of things. Because it's almost like, even if the billionaires, and I would say they probably are normal people to begin with, although I have some doubts on a few of them. But when they get this enormous wealth, they end up in a situation in which they surround themselves with people who agree with them, and they fire anyone who does not. They mostly get rid of people who disagree with them, and it creates a real distortion. It inflates their view that everything they say is right or good or true, and B, it has this effect of denying them in some ways, some access to information. Now, I could go on about Howard Hughes and other billionaires who've literally lost their mind, but I do think that there is a psychosis in a way, in a sort of a billionaire attitude where you think that you have a right, sort of a divine right, to come in with a chainsaw and cut through agencies that you don't even know anything about. The arrogance of it, and I think that is a product just to extend that groupthink of the nature of a billionaire in this day and age is that they are isolated in a way and idolized in a way that really is a reality warping circumstance.
So before we go on, Lisa and Devin, I don't know if you want to pay attention with me about the question that the students who put this panel together is asking about the relationship between history and contemporary policymaking. If you want to address that part of this particular panel, how we can use history in helping to develop policy, contemporary policy.
Oh, well, I had something that I was just wanted to add one or two little things, not necessarily. But I think everything we're talking about is to that point, to that question. I mean, talking about histories, thinking about them, grappling with them, so that they're on our minds as we think about contemporary policymaking. So I'd like to think that that's what's happening here. But I wanted to just jump in and say to what Stephen said, I think it's so interesting that you brought up the temperance movement really briefly. And I think what I'm hearing from that is you brought it up as an example of a social movement that we actually don't hear much about, but it was this significant, huge social movement that lasted for years. And I would argue that that's because it was led by women in the 19th century. And in particular, it was led by women who were also very, very active in larger, all kinds of other forms of social reform, the suffrage movement, anti-poverty movement, settlement homes, right? That's who was leading, because it was about, it was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was about the family. It was about morals. It was about what they felt that they were seeing around them. So, and then, yeah, that's why we don't hear about it, because on the one hand, because it failed and we all like to drink, and alcohol makes a lot of money, right? But also because it's a movement led by women. So that's one of the, to go back to that, and I think I also wanted to just I don't think Howard Zinn is a perfect historian, and I don't think his book is perfect, but I would say that this idea that writing about the failing, writing a book that grapples with the failings of America and the things that have gone wrong, I don't think that it casts that as the whole lot at all. And I'd say for me, the experience of reading that book and why it was so impactful for me is, like you said, Lisa, it was empowering, because for the very first time, I actually saw someone like myself in a history book. I had never seen that. I had never learned about queer people. I had never learned about feminism. I had never learned about, outside of talking very briefly about maybe Eleanor Roosevelt and a quick mention of Susan B. Anthony in history classes, I'd never encountered anything like that. And it also isn't just about seeing myself, right? I also saw all kinds of other people who I had genuinely never realized actually had been involved in leadership, policy making, change making. So that's this, so I think that sometimes there's this perspective that when we teach those histories, right, when we teach the histories of what we've done wrong, when we teach histories of oppression and violence and genocide, that that it's going to make a bunch of people feel really bad and that it's anti-American. I feel that it's the exact opposite, and it's incredibly empowering. And then to me, those are the lessons that I think about when we think about making policy going forward. And obviously, with the title of the panel, creating a better future for all, right? Something to that. That's very subjective, because we all have very different ideas of what a better future looks like. But I know what I want a future to look like. And I should have worn my "Billionaires Shouldn't Exist" t-shirt. Yeah.
Then you two would be clashing.
Instead, I wore my "Protect Trans Kids" sweatshirt, which and here's a quick story that's not necessarily on this topic, but I think it's important. I wear this out in public a lot. Earlier this morning on my way here, I was walking down the street after getting some coffee, and a truck pulled up behind me, a really like a big truck, and I hear a voice go, "Hey, hey!" And I'm, as a woman walking by myself, I freeze. My heart starts racing. I didn't turn around because I usually don't turn. I hear the voice say, "Hey," again. I turn around. I see a big white dude with a huge beard leaning out of his truck, and he goes, "My kid is trans. Thank you." So, I like to apply that to policymaking.
I'll be brief because I think I touched on this a little bit. I first off agree with everything folks have said. I think our country's history is super messy, right? Like we have tremendous horrors and tremendous moments of resilience and turning the corner from things that have been really dark to really bright moments in our country's history. Again, I find a lot of comfort in that mess, to know that we're not just all one thing. We're not just defined by our sins. We're not just defined by our greatness either, but we can kind of grapple with the nuance of that. I think to the question of for this entire panel of like, how do we apply history to our policymaking? I think the question in some ways is like, do we apply history to our policymaking, right? Like, and I think in many ways, sometimes even more than like a partisan divide is the divide of the question of whether we have the ability to be introspective and self-reflective on, again, both the good and the bad that we grapple with, or do we sort of exist in a static snapshot of what we see on our TV screens every day, devoid of context of where we've been and where we can go? I really think that, again, regardless of maybe your political orientation, being able to ground ourselves in a shared history and a common narrative of, again, the good, the bad, and the ugly allows us to maybe find the kinds of compromises and allow for the positive types of disagreements that, as Stephen was saying, the most successful administrations have had. Many of us, I'm sure, have read Team of Rivals, the story about Lincoln's cabinet. Really important, right? Especially at that incredibly, crucial inflection point in the country's history. But again, I think there was, despite the fact that there were disagreements among, between the sort of centrist Republicans and radical Republicans who were abolitionists, being able to come together on a shared understanding of the moment, contextualized in, at that point, the 100 or so year history of the country. I think in many ways we can come together with that shared history to be able to chart a more effective future. But we can't do that if we don't try to apply history at all, which I worry is a growing strain of thought in the political arena that we're seeing. And that's what worries me more than a left-right spectrum.
Oh, and which histories are being applied. I said on the panel yesterday, Make America Great Again it's applied history. They're actually trying to, use very particular histories to make America great again. So
I never know which year, right? Like that's
unclear.
the problem.
Unclear.
Yeah. So,
Project 2025 is, also applied history. They're again, they don't specify which years, but we can tell.
Well, I can give you one, I think, specific lesson to be borne in mind, and maybe this will set up Devin, as my example actually relates to the work you do with EPIC. Actually, Devin, you made the point, which is on everybody's mind, that we're closely divided, polarized nation. I don't think this should be surprised when, for 30 years now, which is a long time in American history, the two parties have been very evenly and finely balanced, and Congress going back and forth. That's a departure from the previous 140 years when you'd have long periods of party dominance and stability. So you had a minority party, so it's Democrats for 70 years between the Civil War and the New Deal, and then you have the New Deal era. It starts to break up in the Reagan era, and then completely it's up for grabs from 1994 on. So, that's always going to raise the temperature of things. But now you could level down from that. And it seems to me that the most enduring social changes or advances in social policy have this feature about them. They are, we like to say compromise. Let's have bipartisanship. That's all fine, I'm all for it, but I actually want to think about it with a different term, which is consent, which is the most enduring major social changes usually have the consent of the opposition party, not necessarily support. Examples, Social Security Act passes with a lot of Republican votes. Medicare passes with a lot of Republican votes, a lot of grumbling, a lot of dissent. Reagan's tax and economic package 1981, passed the Senate 89-10. Joe Biden voted for it. Right? Now, I'm sure a lot of them didn't like it, but they consented to it. And so we've now had this practice for the last 20 years in both parties of passing things by very narrow, almost like parliamentary-style majorities. And there isn't. Now, I think you blame both parties here. I think Obama made a mistake when he said, the first week in office, he said, open some of our, in a meeting with Paul Ryan and Republicans, you open some of our ideas for a micro tax package, and Obama was kind of rude. He said, I don't blame him. He had a big victory, and this goes to their heads. It happens to all of them. It happened to Reagan to a small extent. No, we won the election. We don't. And Nancy Pelosi said, why do we need their input? That was a big mistake. And so this brings me my example that's relevant to Devin. Is about 15 years back, I was talking to Dalton Conley. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a sociologist at Princeton, a board-certified progressive. I don't know if you know him, Dalton. He's,
I don't know.
So you do? Or?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, he served also at a senior position in the Obama administration. He made an interesting comment to me. He said the biggest mistake that the left made on domestic policy in America in the last 50 years was opposing Nixon's family assistance plan, which now was his version of the universal basic income.
Oh, yeah.
And that thing died from a left-right pincer. And people on the left didn't like it. Some people on the right didn't like it. 49 of the 50 state governors passed a resolution supporting the plan because they wanted to offload welfare to Washington. The one person, guess who? You know who it was. Of course you do. And so that brings us up to sort of more recent times. So Obamacare, go back to 1993, 94. The Republicans, Bob Dole was willing to make a compromise on health care. Pat Moynihan was going to be the co-sponsor with him, and the Clintons refused because they had made their plan. By the way, I'll just say this without getting into any of the wonky details. Hillary's plan, with all the defects I think it had, was much superior to Obamacare. And that was a moment missed when you would have had the minority party. Remember, Democrats had a big majority going to the 94 election. There was a moment missed when you could have had the consent of the minority party for a better plan than the one we ended up with Obama. So the lesson going forward, I'll restate it this way. This is one of my axioms I've been promoting for years, is only Nixon go to China, right? I think only Democrats can fix the long-term unsustainability of our entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, if Republicans will let them. Because there got to be some compromises there. I get in a lot of trouble with my tax-phobic friends saying, look, the problem with Medicare is the tax rate was never high enough. At least it had a tax. Sorry, brief editorial rant. George W. Bush brings us Medicare Part D with no funding mechanism. The first time we'd ever passed one with no fund. At least Medicare had a tax to begin to pay for it. And then the converse is and I won't explain why, I'll just assert it, only Republicans can fix our health care system, if Democrats will let them. And that will require some concessions on Democrats on certain Republican ways of thinking about how government can affect complex markets. And they're not good at that, I'll just say that. But that's where we are. It may take a crisis for that to get us there. I mean, again, there's a mini example. Last thing, 2008, the financial world crashes. Hank Paulson comes to Congress on Friday and says we need $800 billion right away. Congress says, what? We're not going to do that. The markets crash on Monday. Tuesday, Congress votes for it.
Okay, no problem. We're getting a lot of great questions here, and so panel, I'm going to do something I've never done before with these questions from the audience. So I'm going to give you three at a time, and if you all could take one of the questions, and then I'll do in threes again, so that these questions can be answered from. Oh, we're not going to make it, but anyway, here we go. The first one is, as an indigenous person, I can't help but see our colonial history repeating itself in our policy. How can we begin to decolonize our history? Policy plus policy, both foreign and domestic. And then the next question is, how can we progressively learn from history when the American educational system ignores, dismantles revised history? Many of us are operating on misinformation and disinformation. So that's another one for somebody to take. And then the next one in this group of three is, how important or not is the study of human nature in informing our understanding of history and informing contemporary policy making? And if one person could take that. And if we could limit our responses to maybe 2 to 3 minutes, I know that's horrible.
I'll jump in on the second one, if that's all right.
Good.
Just quickly, I mean, I have been astonished by the reports coming out of Washington for the past 75 days, where you had the Pentagon erasing websites that mentioned the code talkers, the Navajo code talkers, whose language helped protect America in World War II. You had an erasure of the Tuskegee Airmen. You had an erasure of Black veteran Jackie Robinson, in this sort of notion that this is all DEI, references to our history, reference to the fact that a Native American helped hoist the flag at Iwo Jima, which which my grandfather fought at. The idea that they were actually going to possibly flag the Enola Gay plane that dropped the nuclear bomb because it had the word gay.
That's my favorite one.
Now they reversed course, but the question is how did we get here where people of either such egregious ignorance or malevolence would erase that part of the history of the Pentagon? Then you go to the National Park Service where they temporarily erased Harriet Tubman from the story of the Underground Railroad and minimized slavery, and downplayed slavery in the whole issue of the Underground Railroad of taking people from slavery, from slave states to free states. Then you have the ongoing crisis in Florida under DeSantis, where they had a program or an educational workbook group that was trying to tell Florida students about the benefits of slavery, which, by the way, Curtis Yarvin has advocated as well. I'm not associating you with every one of his views, Stephen.
I just said I know the guy. I didn't say I agree with him.
Literally trying to teach kids from 7th grade to 12th grade that there were benefits of slavery for the slaves. We are in a circumstance, an anti-intellectual, anti-knowledge, pro-ignorance environment where we have this massive reaction to the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yet you have someone like Pete Hegseth being installed at the head of the Department of Defense, whose main qualification is being a Fox News Entertainment, I shouldn't say news, Fox Entertainment host, who was accused by someone of roofing them. Now, he's denied it. The case was settled. There, what have you. His sister-in-law said that he was an abusive fellow. There were serious issues. He even squandered the money of a Koch organization called Concerned Veterans of America.
So Lisa.
Yes, I know. Okay, so I'm going to close. I'll close. But so we have like this idea that if there's a woman who has a high post in the military, she's a DEI hire, or we have a black soldier who has risen through the ranks through his talent to lead a part of the military, and that's a DEI hire. That's illegitimate. But we have someone at the top of the Defense Department who never should have been confirmed to that job, and this effort to erase and reform our history in ways that are absolutely fundamentally false. Yeah. The question was, I think I answered it, but
Thank you very much. Who would like to take the?
I'll just take that thing.
All right, Kate.
I have another T-shirt and it says, it just says "America is embarrassing," and I wear it on select occasions, and it's feeling so relevant. It's so embarrassing. And this is just one thing I'll say when it comes to book bans, and it's just never a good look. And I think when we think about his, hindsight and foresight, it's never a good look. We don't look back kindly on leaders and people who have banned books and repressed ideas and squashed ideas. It's not cool. Very briefly, what I want to say to the Indigenous person who asked that question, I want to say thank you for asking that, and I am sorry for what it feels like right now for you and your community. But another book that I wanted to plug on the heels of talking about Zen is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, The Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. So for people who want to read, learn more, again, The Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz follows in the tradition of Zen, but with a really brilliant and radical focus on Indigenous histories.
Thank you.
I can take the last one, if that's good. I'm not an anthropologist. I don't understand human nature as well as many experts do, but I sort of have the belief that by grounding our history in the broader context of the species, we actually kind of come out of it looking pretty good, right? Like, human history has been characterized by brutality and by small-mindedness and by insularness, and we sort of exist in a miracle of being able to escape from that, despite some of our impulses to retreat back to our more base instincts. Like, if you think about it, the Enlightenment movement is a miracle, right? The idea that we have a semi-functioning democracy, even still, though not perfect, is kind of a miracle, right? The fact that we have a global order that our country created and benefits from a ton is how lucky are we, right, to be able to exist in that. I also do think, though, that, again, understanding all of these wonderful things that have happened to get us away from, again, the caveman instincts that have again, really characterize the species for tens of thousands of years means that we should treat those gains as really precious, right? Like we need to protect and preserve democracy because it is so fragile. We have to protect Enlightenment ideals because they're so fragile, because our base instincts are opposed to those. But I really do think that by grounding our history, again, this sort of goes to what I was talking about earlier, like do we actually apply history to our current analysis? By grounding what our present challenges are in the context of the really long distance we've come as a species and as a people, again, I think it makes us a bit more, it makes these things more precious, right? And it makes us needing to fight for them more fiercely against the impulses that we see trying to take us back to a time where I don't think any of us are going to be better off or more enlightened or more collective, more of a collective together. So I love the question. I wish I understood human nature a bit better. I think might have some better answers for the political moment that we're in.
Well said.
Okay, our next three. Is there a risk that politics and policy won't follow public opinion in this age due to the oligarch control of media and algorithms creating echo chambers? The next question is, which period of U.S. history should we be revisiting in order to survive the political period we're in now? And the next one is, do the speakers have an arcane or surprising historical fact that they would like us to know? Stephen, anything?
You got answers to all three.
Well, I know I'm writing down the questions. Yeah, the public opinion question is, that's a good one, because ultimately the public is supposed to rule, be the final arbiter. Problem is do politicians follow public opinion or lead it? And the answer is yes. Or the answer is no. I mean, it's the other thing. I mean, I don't want to go on long about this, so I won't. I'm a huge consumer of survey data and a huge critic of it at the same time. So here's the problem with opinion polls, which is why I like this sort of fourth level work that people like David Shore do. If you're asking people a binary question, are you for Harris or for Trump? Are you Coke or Pepsi? What's your preference? Those results are usually pretty reliable, and they're usually pretty steady within a margin of error. When you're surveying people's attitudes about issues, they're all over the map. And sometimes the polls are, if not fake, they're actually crafted to get a result that you want. I can give lots of examples. I'll skip over it. I go over this at great length with students sometimes. So when you say public opinion, it's hard to know exactly what you mean. It was, right now, I love the polls right now. They're showing massive support for free trade and against tariffs amongst Americans, where for the last 40 years it's been pretty close and usually slightly favorable towards tariffs and protection. And does this really represent deep reflection and a deep change of conviction of Americans? I doubt it. I think it's the sort of the chaos of the way this is going about it right now. So that's a hard question to answer. Ultimately, I think politicians follow public opinion. They see a parade going down the street and they want to get in front of it. I'll give you the quick answer of the period to be studied. It's that decade before the Civil War. It's popular to say we're going to have a Civil War again. I don't think so, because it lacks certain conditions, but certain aspects of fundamental differences of opinion have some analogs and parallels. And so, I mean, remember that in 1854, Lincoln thought he was done with politics. He was happy to be a railroad lawyer, and it was the political catastrophe of the Kansas-Nebraska Act that summoned him back into politics. And you always read his presidential speeches, but I think his speeches, including the previous one, his speech to the Temperance Association, why do you want to speak to, he was a drinker, right? He didn't think they were nuts, but he understood that they're a special interest group whose purposes ought to be integrated the best we can into larger purposes of Republican government. So it's a really interesting speech to read. All those speeches, he's analyzing the problem in a very effective way, and it is a preview of the future to come. And then what I do with students is we spend an hour on, I talked earlier about compromise. Was he right to have rejected the Crittenden Compromise? If you don't know it, it was the proposal in the transition period, 1860-61. Say, let's just call this all off and call off the secession, and let's just extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way out to the Pacific Ocean and go from there. And Lincoln, who was willing to compromise on a lot, said no to that. And then the war came, as he put it, right? Was that a good idea or not? Well, that's a good exercise to go through with people about historical judgment. Why would he then, or why wouldn't he? Because other people around him other Republicans were for taking that compromise.
Okay. Thank you. very much. In the last 7 minutes that we have, here are two questions. How can we ensure? How can we ensure that applied history informs policymaking without family? I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip this for a second. What history did the authors of Project 2025 read?
Well, I'm going to jump in because starting in November of 2023, I began a project to drag Project 2025 into the spotlight. And there were a number of groups who joined in that effort ultimately to describe what this 900-page document was intending. As you probably saw during the campaign, Trump denied that he had anything to do with it after appearing at a Heritage Foundation event and talking about how they were going to fill in all the details. And then, of course, now we're seeing significant portions of it implemented in this most recent 75 days. Not all of it, but significant portions of it. What history were they reading? I mean, I've read a lot of the underlying documents that they cite or they use to support some of the efforts to change HHS or abortion access or gay rights and more. But I think if you do want to learn more about Project 2025, let me know. I have a whole set of resources that we are working on to help explain the impacts on the current policies, including things like impoundment, about how budgets work or how a president may change things. But I did want to go back to just quickly with the one question, the factoid that I think is worth saying. I just want to say this. Many on the right have embraced this notion of originalism or original intent. I think one of the best examples of why original intent should not be binding is that during the debate over the Civil Rights Act of 1964, some right-wingers were determined to kill it with a poison pill, and the poison pill was to add sex, to add discrimination against women to that measure. And they thought that would kill the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Instead, it passed with that protection, that particular protection against sex discrimination as part of that landmark legislation. But if we were confined to the original intent of the drafters, that would have been the opposite. It would have been opposite land, so therefore we would not be able to protect, at least in some version of the Civil Rights Act, against discrimination against women.
Okay, I'm going to try to do justice to the person whose question I couldn't read the first time. How can we ensure that applied history informs policymaking without falling into the trap of cherry-picking historical analogies about certain current agendas? What safeguards or methods help keep that process honest and useful? Anybody on the end?
I think it's a really good question. I think it requires us to view history as a whole, right? Like, we have to view the long arc of the history of the Republic and all the good things and the bad things, but it's about the direction, not the particular point in time, right? Like, it's not useful to view a map or like on your GPS just based off of the, the sort of signposts along the way, but it's like, where were you and where did you end up? Because obviously, in a country's history, there's, especially in a democracy, there's debate, there's changes in power, there's shifts in public opinion. But yeah, I think if you just take a snapshot in time, which I think is what we have to be opposed to today, right? We can't be taking snapshots of our current moment. We also can't take snapshots of 1859 as indicative of the story of slavery in this country. Like, the story has to go all the way to 1865 and all the way to 1964 and everything in between, right? Like, it's dangerous if we have a myopic view of any piece of history because you miss the broader context, right? Now, how do we actualize that, I think, is a harder question, but I think it probably does just require us to push back on, again, the snapshot type of thinking and rhetoric that I think is quite dangerous. But yeah, context matters, and I think the long arc of history matters.
Just to add a quick thought on that, it's easy. There's no foolproof method to try and avoid errors. It's easy to misapply what is thought to be a very clear lesson of history. A good example is that's very relevant again right now is Lyndon Johnson. What led to part of his path to penance on Vietnam was the Munich analogy. If I give in on Vietnam, if I don't see this through, if I don't escalate, it'll be Munich all over again. Appeasement of aggressors. George H.W. Bush thought the same thing in 1991. And now people are drawing some of the same parallels. Well, Percio had the Munich speech of Vance a month ago, and then sort of Trump's way he was beating on Ukraine. Oh, it's like Munich, he's selling out Ukraine the way we sold out Czechoslovakia. Okay. A useful analogy, however, one possible tool or one way of trying to acquire some wisdom is to put yourself into the frame of mind of the other person. So everyone said, well, the Soviet Union's paranoid. Well, okay, is there a reason for that? And I have to skip over the whole story except to say that Ronald Reagan changed his mind slowly in the course of his presidency, and one of them was his own people listening to the last serving World War II senior Soviet officer who went to a couple of the summits, who said, here's what you Americans don't understand about us. Your model is Munich. Our model is June 22, 1941. And our lesson is no more surprise attacks from Germany or anybody. And Reagan took that to heart, and some other things too. It's a very rich, complicated, interesting story. And that turned out to be really important to saying, well, the Munich lesson is a valuable one, but it's not the only one, and maybe it doesn't apply here.
Would you please join me in thanking our panelists?
Oh, wait, I didn't get to talk. Oh, yeah. I didn't get to talk, and I will, because I have a mic. I am going to end with a very arcane historical fact that didn't really come up here, but it touches on a few of these things, and it's just a really random one, so you can listen. Some people would say that the first woman to vote in an election in United States history was Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was a suffrage activist and an abolitionist. And she voted she actually got arrested for trying to vote in a school board election in Massachusetts, but she voted because she was brought into a local Mohawk tribe that was matrilineal, where the women actually ran the elections. And she was welcomed in, she worked closely with them, and she was able to vote in their tribal councils, and then took that back out to say, see, look, women can vote, look what that looks like. The fun fact that does relate to some of the stuff happening here at CWA is that her son-in-law was so inspired by her work that he created a character in his most famous book that was inspired by her. And her son-in-law was L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz. And he created Glinda the Good Witch, inspired by her and the incredible work that she did. So there's your Wizard of Oz history.
All right, we have to clear the room.
Nobody seems to know anymore that women...
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.